The Istanbul Gambit. Chapter 1, Shadows on the Bosphorus. The call to prayer echoed across the Golden Horn as David Brooks adjusted his fedora against the October wind. Istanbul in 1943 was a city of whispered secrets and shifting allegiances, where Nazi agents rubbed shoulders with British operatives in smoky cafes, each pretending not to recognize the other. Brooks had been stationed here for 18 months, long enough to know that in this neutral crossroads between Europe and Asia, neutrality was just another word for opportunity. He checked his watch, 7:23 p.m. 3 minutes until the rendezvous. The Galata Bridge stretched before him, its fishing lines disappearing into the dark waters of the Bosphorus. Somewhere in the maze of Constantinople's ancient streets, a German scientist named Dr. Heinrich Richter was preparing to commit the ultimate betrayal against the Third Reich. Brooks had received the coded message 2 days earlier, hidden in a book of Ottoman poetry purchased from a vendor near the Hagia Sophia. The message was brief but electrifying: Nightingale wishes to fly west. Requires assistance. High-value cargo. MI6 had been trying to turn German scientists for months, but few had both the access and the courage to defect. Richter was different. He worked on something the intelligence reports called Project Donnerschlag, and from what little they knew, it could change the course of the war. A figure emerged from the evening crowd, walking with the measured pace of someone trying not to appear nervous. Dr. Heinrich Richter was exactly as described in his file: mid-50s, wire-rimmed spectacles, the soft build of a man who spent his days hunched over equations rather than physical labor. But his eyes held a hardness Brooks recognized, the look of a man who had seen too much and decided he could stomach no more. Herr Brooks? Richter's English carried a thick Bavarian accent. Dr. Richter. You're punctual. Brooks didn't offer his hand. In this business, the fewer physical gestures, the better. Walk with me. They moved along the bridge, two men discussing nothing more suspicious than the weather to any observer. Brooks had learned long ago that the best place to conduct sensitive business was often in plain sight, surrounded by the mundane bustle of daily life. You understand what you're asking of me, Richter said quietly. I cannot simply disappear. There are complications. There always are. Tell me about them. Richter was silent for a long moment, watching a fisherman reel in his line. My work is closely monitored. SS Oberfuhrer Klaus Brenner personally oversees the project. He suspects everyone of disloyalty, not without reason, given the current circumstances. Brooks knew Brenner by reputation, a career SS officer who had risen through the ranks by combining genuine competence with ruthless ambition. He was known for his methodical approach to counterintelligence and his particular hatred of what he called intellectual cowardice among German scientists. What about your family? My wife died in the bombing of Hamburg. My son. Richter's voice caught. My son was killed at Stalingrad. There is nothing left for me in Germany but the knowledge that my work helps prolong this madness. The personal motivation was good. It meant Richter was less likely to be a double agent. Men seeking revenge against their own government were often the most reliable defectors, though they could also be the most unpredictable. Your work, Brooks said carefully. How valuable would you say it is to the German war effort? Richter stopped walking and turned to face him. Behind his spectacles, his eyes were haunted. Herr Brooks, if the project succeeds, your invasion of France will fail before it begins. The weapon we are developing, it would make the Luftwaffe's current capabilities seem like children's toys. A chill ran down Brooks' spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. What kind of weapon? That is what I will tell your superiors when I am safely in London. But I can say this, we are perhaps 6 months from a working prototype. Maybe less if certain technical challenges are resolved. 6 months. Brooks did the mental calculation. Intelligence suggested the Allied invasion of Europe was planned for sometime in 1944. If the Germans had a new superweapon ready by then. What would you need from us? Brooks asked. Safe passage out of Istanbul. New identity documents. And. Richter hesitated. There is someone else. Someone who must come with me. Brooks felt his instincts prickle. Complications were never good in extraction operations. Who? Dr. Anna Kellner. She is my research partner, but more than that, she has been documenting everything. Technical specifications, test results, personnel files. Without her notes, much of what I know would be incomplete. Is she willing to defect? She suggested it. Anna lost her entire family in a concentration camp last year. Her loyalty to the Reich died with them. 2 defectors instead of 1. The risk was exponentially higher, but if this woman had documentation. Where is she now? At the German consulate. She arrived yesterday under the pretense of consulting on technical matters with our diplomatic staff. It was the only way we could both be in Istanbul without raising suspicion. Brooks considered the tactical situation. The German consulate was heavily guarded, and extracting someone from inside would be nearly impossible. But if she was there voluntarily, perhaps there was another way. Can she leave the consulate freely? For now, yes. But Brenner will arrive tomorrow to check on our progress. Once he's here, our movements will be severely restricted. Tomorrow. Brooks had less than 24 hours to plan and execute a double extraction from one of the most heavily surveilled cities in the world. He'd pulled off more difficult operations, but never with so little preparation time. There's something else, Richter continued. Anna believes there may be a security leak in the British intelligence network here. Someone has been asking very specific questions about German scientific personnel. Brooks felt ice in his veins. A mole in MI6 Istanbul operation would explain several recent failures, including the loss of 2 agents in the past month. What kind of questions? About departure schedules, safe house locations, extraction protocols. The kind of details only someone inside would know. If there was a mole, this entire operation could be a trap. But the potential intelligence value was too high to ignore, and besides, Brooks had been in this business long enough to know that paranoia, while useful, could also paralyze you when action was needed. We'll proceed as planned, he decided. But with additional precautions. Meet me tomorrow at 2 p.m. at the entrance to the Grand Bazaar. Bring Dr. Kellner. And Richter, if this goes wrong, you don't know me. Understood? Richter nodded grimly. Understood. But Herr Brooks, if we are betrayed, it will not be by choice. Brenner has methods of extracting information that. Then we won't get caught, Brooks cut him off. He'd seen enough of Nazi interrogation techniques to know exactly what Richter was implying. As they parted ways, Brooks began mentally cataloging everything he would need for the operation. Forged papers, a safe route to the harbor, a boat captain who asked no questions and accepted payment in gold rather than conversation. Most importantly, he needed to identify the possible mole before they could sabotage the mission. Walking back through the narrow streets of Galata, Brooks noticed the same face twice, a thin man in a dark coat who seemed to be window shopping with unusual persistence. Professional surveillance or coincidence? In Istanbul, it was often impossible to tell the difference, which was exactly what made the city so dangerous for people in his line of work. He ducked into a kebab shop and ordered tea, using the opportunity to observe the street through the window. The thin man was gone, but that didn't mean much. Good surveillance teams worked in shifts, and the Germans had some very good teams operating in the city. Brooks sipped his tea and began planning. By this time tomorrow, Dr. Heinrich Richter and Dr. Anna Kellner would either be on their way to London with intelligence that could help win the war, or they would all be dead. In his experience, those were usually the only 2 options in operations like this. The call to prayer ended, and the city settled into its evening rhythm. Brooks finished his tea, left payment on the table, and stepped back into the maze of Constantinople's ancient streets. Tomorrow would bring either triumph or disaster, but tonight, he had work to do. Chapter 2, The Consulate Gambit. Brooks spent the night in his safe house, a cramped apartment above a carpet merchant's shop in Beyoğlu, studying street maps and contingency plans. By dawn, he had identified 3 possible extraction routes and twice as many things that could go wrong with each one. His contact at the British consulate, James Whitmore, arrived at precisely 8 a.m. with coffee and bad news written across his face. "There's been a development," Whitmore said without preamble. "Our friend Brenner didn't wait until today. He arrived on the midnight train from Ankara." Brooks cursed under his breath. The timeline had just accelerated dramatically. "What's his status?" "Checked into the Para Palace Hotel at 2 a.m. Our sources say he's meeting with consulate staff at 10 a.m., then conducting individual interviews with all German personnel currently in the city. Including our scientists?" "Almost certainly. David, if they're going to move, it has to be this morning. Once Brenner starts his interviews." Brooks didn't need him to finish the sentence. SS interrogation techniques were thorough and effective. Even if Richter and Kellner had perfect cover stories, Brenner would spot inconsistencies that a less experienced officer might miss. "I need updated intelligence on the consulate security," Brooks said. "Guard rotations, entry points, communication protocols." Whitmore handed him a manila folder. "Everything we have from the past week." "But David, extracting someone from inside the German consulate, it's not just difficult, it's practically a declaration of war. If you're caught, then I won't be caught." Brooks opened the folder and began studying the surveillance photographs. The German consulate occupied a converted Ottoman mansion in the Para district, its high walls and narrow windows making it look more like a fortress than a diplomatic facility. But every fortress had weaknesses if you knew how to look for them. A delivery truck arriving with supplies. Kitchen staff arriving for the morning shift. A maintenance crew scheduled to service the telephone lines. Each represented a potential opportunity, though also significant risk. Brooks made his decision. "I'm going to need a uniform and credentials for the telephone maintenance crew. Can you arrange that?" "Within 2 hours, yes. But you'll only have a small window, maybe 30 minutes before someone notices an extra worker." "That should be enough." Brooks was already mentally rehearsing the operation. Get inside, locate the scientists, create a distraction, extract them during the confusion. Simple in concept, though he knew that simple plans were often the hardest to execute. At 11:30 a.m., Brooks approached the German consulate wearing the coveralls and tool belt of a telephone technician. His forged work order indicated a routine maintenance check on the building's communication lines, exactly the kind of mundane task that security guards typically ignored. The Turkish guard at the gate barely glanced at his credentials before directing him to the service entrance. Inside, Brooks moved with the purposeful efficiency of a man who belonged there, following the building's layout he had memorized from architectural plans. The consulate was busier than usual, with additional security personnel stationed throughout the corridors. Brooks could hear voices from the main conference room, likely Brenner conducting his interviews. He needed to locate Richter and Kellner before their turn came. A maid directed him to the technical services office on the 2nd floor, where he began the process of actually checking telephone connections while keeping his ears open for useful intelligence. It didn't take long. "Worried about Dr. Kellner," someone was saying in German from the adjacent office. "She seems nervous, keeps asking about departure schedules." "Brenner will sort it out," came the reply. "He has methods for determining loyalty that are quite effective." Brooks felt his pulse quicken. He needed to find the scientists immediately. Moving through the building with practiced stealth, he located them in a small library on the 3rd floor, ostensibly reviewing technical documents but clearly waiting with barely controlled anxiety. Dr. Anna Kellner was younger than he had expected, perhaps 35, with the kind of intense intelligence that seemed to radiate from her dark eyes. She looked up as he entered, and he saw her immediately recognize that he wasn't who he appeared to be. "Telephone maintenance," he said quietly in German, then switched to English. "Dr. Richter, I believe you're expecting me." Relief flooded Richter's face. "Yes, we've been having problems with our line to Berlin." "I'm sure we can fix that," Brooks replied, then lowered his voice. "We need to leave now." Brenner is conducting interviews, and you're both on his list. Dr. Kellner stood quickly, gathering a leather satchel that presumably contained her research notes. How do we get out? Brooks had been considering this question since entering the building. The main entrance was too heavily guarded, and the service entrance would require passing through areas with too many witnesses. But there was a third option, risky but possible. The telephone cables run along the back wall of the building, he explained. There's a maintenance ladder that leads to the roof, and from there we can access the adjacent building. You want us to climb down the outside of the building? Kellner looked skeptical. It's that, or explain to Brenner why you're so interested in departure schedules. That settled the matter. Moving quickly but carefully, Brooks led them through the building's service corridors to the rear stairwell. The maintenance ladder was exactly where the architectural plans indicated, though it looked considerably more precarious in person than it had on paper. They were halfway up when the alarm began sounding. Schnell! Brooks hissed, pushing them toward the roof access. Below, he could hear running footsteps and shouted orders in German. Someone had discovered their absence, probably earlier than expected. On the roof, the October wind cut through their clothes as they ran toward the neighboring building. The gap between structures was wider than Brooks had hoped, perhaps 8 feet, but manageable for desperate people. I can't make that jump, Kellner said, looking at the distance. You don't have a choice, Brooks replied grimly. Behind them, the roof access door burst open and armed guards poured out. Richter went first, landing hard but safely on the adjacent roof. Brooks grabbed Kellner's hand. On 3. 1, 2. They jumped together as gunshots rang out behind them. Brooks felt the wind from a bullet pass his ear as they landed in a heap on the neighboring building's roof. Below them, the streets of Pera were already filling with German security personnel beginning a systematic search. This way, Brooks said, leading them toward another maintenance ladder. They descended quickly into an alley behind a carpet warehouse, where Brooks had positioned a change of clothes and emergency supplies the night before. 20 minutes later, 3 Turkish merchants emerged from the warehouse and began walking calmly toward the Galata Bridge. To any observer, they appeared to be discussing nothing more interesting than the day's business prospects. But behind them, the German consulate was in chaos, and SS Oberfuhrer Klaus Brenner was beginning an investigation that would soon extend far beyond 2 missing scientists. Chapter 3, The Mole Hunt. The safe house in the old quarter of Sultanahmet had been chosen for its multiple escape routes and inconspicuous location, sandwiched between a spice merchant and a small mosque where the faithful came for evening prayers. Brooks had used it twice before, and both times it had served its purpose perfectly. Tonight, however, he felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the building's security features. Dr. Kellner sat at the small wooden table, her research notes spread before her like a map of Germany's darkest secrets. What Brooks had seen in the past hour was enough to keep him awake for weeks. Technical specifications for what appeared to be a revolutionary aircraft design, performance projections that defied everything Allied intelligence believed about German capabilities, and most disturbing of all, production schedules that suggested mass deployment was closer than anyone had imagined. The prototype has already completed its first test flights, Kellner was explaining to Brooks and Richter. Range of over 1,000 kilometers, speed approaching 900 kilometers per hour, armament capacity that could level entire city blocks. Brooks did the mental conversion to familiar units and felt his blood chill. If accurate, this represented a quantum leap in aviation technology that could indeed render the planned invasion of France suicidal. What are you calling it? He asked. Officially, Project Donnerschlag, Project Thunderbolt. But the engineering team has another name, Sturmvogel. Storm Bird. Richter leaned forward, his face grave. The technical challenges seemed impossible a year ago. But Anna's work on the propulsion system. He gestured helplessly. She solved problems that our best minds said couldn't be solved. Brooks studied the woman across from him with new respect. Dr. Anna Kellner wasn't just a defector with valuable intelligence, she was possibly one of the most brilliant aeronautical engineers in the world, and she had just handed the Allies the blueprints to their own potential destruction. "How many people know these specifications?" he asked. "Perhaps a dozen engineers, half that many in management," Kellner replied. And now Brenner, who arrived specifically to assess security around the project. The implications were staggering. If MI6 could get this intelligence to London quickly enough, Allied planners could begin developing countermeasures. But if the Germans discovered the security breach first? A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. 3 short taps, a pause, then 2 more, the agreed-upon signal from his contact. Brooks opened the door to find James Whitmore, but the man's expression immediately put him on alert. "We have a problem," Whitmore said without preamble. "The Germans are tearing the city apart looking for your friends here." "But that's not the worst part." Brooks felt his instincts prickle. "What's the worst part?" "They know about this safe house." The words hit like a physical blow. Brooks had used this location precisely because it was known only to a handful of people within MI6's Istanbul operation. If the Germans had identified it. "How certain are you?" "Our surveillance teams reported unusual German activity in this neighborhood starting about an hour ago. Plainclothes officers conducting routine inquiries with shopkeepers, asking about strangers, foreign visitors, anyone behaving suspiciously." Brooks was already moving, gathering essential documents and signaling to the scientists to prepare for immediate departure. But his mind was racing beyond the immediate tactical problem. Someone with access to MI6's most sensitive information had betrayed them. "James, I need a complete list of everyone who knew about this location." "David, there isn't time." "Make time. Our operation has been compromised from the beginning, and until we identify the source, everything we do is feeding intelligence directly to the Germans." Whitmore reluctantly provided the names: himself, Brooks, the station chief, 2 senior case officers, and 3 support staff with security clearances. 8 people, any one of whom could be the traitor who had condemned dozens of Allied agents to death or capture. Dr. Kellner had finished securing her research notes in a waterproof case. "Where do we go now?" Brooks considered their options. Every established safe house was potentially compromised. Every known extraction route might be monitored. They needed to think like hunted animals rather than intelligence professionals. The old Ottoman cisterns beneath the city, he decided. If we can reach the entrance near the Hagia Sophia, we can move underground to the harbor district without being seen. It was a desperate plan, but desperation was often the mother of survival in their business. The ancient cisterns had been built over 1,000 years ago to supply Constantinople with water, and their labyrinthine passages provided a hidden highway beneath the modern city. They left the safe house separately, using different routes to avoid detection. Brooks went first, moving through the narrow streets with the practiced invisibility of a man who had spent years learning to blend into crowds. Behind him, at carefully timed intervals, came Richter and Kellner, disguised as an elderly Turkish couple taking an evening stroll. The entrance to the cisterns was hidden behind a tourist shop that sold Byzantine artifacts of dubious authenticity. The elderly proprietor, Mehmet, had been on MI6's payroll for 3 years and asked no questions when Brooks explained their needs. "The passages are dangerous at night," Mehmet warned as he led them to a concealed stairway behind his shop. "Easy to become lost, and some sections flood with the tide." "We'll manage," Brooks replied, though privately he shared the old man's concerns. The cisterns were vast, and without proper maps, they could wander for hours while German search teams methodically eliminated their other options. 20 minutes later, they were moving through tunnels that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. Their flashlight beams illuminated ancient stone columns and archways that had supported the weight of Constantinople for centuries. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of stagnant water. "This way," Brooks whispered, consulting a rough map Mehmet had provided. According to his calculations, they needed to travel approximately 2 kilometers underground to reach an exit point near the Galata waterfront. They had covered perhaps half that distance when Kellner grabbed his arm. "Listen," she whispered. In the distance, echoing through the ancient passages, came the sound of voices and footsteps. The Germans had found their trail. Brooks felt the familiar calm that came with mortal danger. All the planning and contingencies were finished now. Survival would depend on speed, luck, and the kind of desperate improvisation that either saved lives or ended them. "This way," he said, leading them deeper into the maze of Byzantine engineering. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew steadily closer. Chapter 4: Underground Pursuit. The ancient cisterns of Constantinople had been built to withstand the siege of armies, but they had never been designed for the deadly game of cat and mouse now unfolding in their depths. Brooks led his charges through passages where emperors had once walked, their footsteps echoing off stone that had been carved when Britain was still a collection of warring tribes. The voices behind them were getting closer, and worse, they were coming from multiple directions. The Germans had clearly studied the cistern layouts and deployed multiple teams to cut off escape routes. Brooks realized with growing unease that this level of preparation suggested foreknowledge of their specific plan, more evidence of the mole in MI6's operation. "How many ways out of here?" Dr. Richter whispered, his voice tight with controlled fear. "For that I know of," Brooks replied quietly. "But if they're covering all the entrances..." He didn't finish the sentence. They all understood the implications. Dr. Kellner had proven remarkably steady under pressure, moving through the dangerous passages with careful precision and maintaining complete silence except when absolutely necessary to communicate. Now she touched Brooks' shoulder and pointed toward a side passage he hadn't noticed. "Water sound," she whispered in heavily accented English. "Different." Brooks listened carefully and realized she was right. The sound of moving water from that direction had a different quality, fresher, with the rhythm of something flowing rather than stagnant. It might lead to a storm drain that connected to the harbor. They changed direction, following the sound deeper into the labyrinth. The passage narrowed considerably, forcing them to move in single file through spaces that had probably been maintenance tunnels for the original Byzantine engineers. The walls closed in around them, but the sound of flowing water grew stronger. Behind them, the German voices had taken on a note of frustration. Their pursuers were discovering what Brooks had hoped, that the cisterns were far more complex than any modern map suggested, with countless dead ends and false passages that could consume hours of search time. The tunnel they were following began to slope downward more steeply, and soon they could hear not just water but the distinctive sound of harbor traffic, engines, horns, the general bustle of maritime commerce. They were getting close to the waterfront. The passage ended at an iron grate that had probably been installed during the Ottoman period to prevent unauthorized access. The metal was old but solid, and the lock that secured it was a massive thing that would require considerable force to break. Brooks examined their obstacle while Dr. Kellner listened for sounds of pursuit. The grate was hinged on the left side, and the lock mechanism, while formidable, showed signs of age and corrosion. If they could find the right leverage point. "Heinrich," he called softly to Dr. Richter. "You're a physicist. How much force would we need to snap a lock mechanism of this vintage?" Richter examined the iron work with professional interest. "Depends on the metallurgy, but given the corrosion patterns and the stress points, perhaps 200 kilograms of force applied at the optimal angle." Brooks looked around for something to use as a lever. The tunnel contained various debris from centuries of use, broken stone, pieces of metal, fragments of pottery. Nothing immediately suitable, but then Dr. Kellner produced something from her research satchel. "Pry bar," she said simply, holding up a tool that looked like it belonged in a laboratory rather than an escape operation. "You carry a pry bar in your research notes?" "German engineering requires creative solutions sometimes," she replied with what might have been a smile. The tool was perfectly designed for precision work, and applied at the right point on the lock mechanism, it provided exactly the leverage they needed. The ancient iron gave way with a groan that seemed thunderously loud in the enclosed space. Beyond the grate lay a storm drain that led directly to the harbor. They could see daylight ahead, along with the masts and smokestacks of ships anchored in the Golden Horn. Freedom was perhaps 50 meters away. They emerged from the drain into the controlled chaos of Istanbul's waterfront. Fishing boats, cargo vessels, and passenger ferries created a forest of masts and rigging that provided excellent cover for three fugitives who needed to disappear quickly. Brooks had a contact among the harbor pilots, a Greek named Stavros who had been ferrying people and messages across the Bosphorus for various intelligence services since before the war began. His boat was moored near the old Galata Bridge, disguised as just another fishing vessel among dozens of similar craft. They made their way through the harbor district, three more faces in the crowd of merchants, sailors, and laborers who made their living from the sea. Brooks had coached his companions on appearing casual, but he could see the tension in their movements as they navigated through the maze of waterfront commerce. Stavros was exactly where he was supposed to be, mending nets with the patient concentration of a man who had been doing the same work for 40 years. He looked up as they approached, his weathered face showing no surprise at seeing Brooks with two strangers. "Good fishing today?" Brooks asked in Greek. "Always good fishing for those who know where to look," Stavros replied, completing the recognition code. "But the weather may turn rough soon." Translation: German patrol boats were increasing their activities in the harbor. They needed to leave quickly. "We're looking for passage to the European side," Brooks said carefully. Stavros nodded toward his boat. "I know a quiet spot where the fish bite well. No crowds, no noise from other boats." Dr. Kellner and Dr. Richter exchanged glances but followed Brooks aboard the fishing vessel. Below decks, the boat was larger than it appeared from outside, with modifications that suggested Stavros had been in the smuggling business long before he began working for various intelligence services. "How long to reach the other side?" Brooks asked as Stavros began preparing for departure. "Under normal circumstances, 40 minutes. But these are not normal circumstances." The Greek pointed toward the harbor mouth, where a German patrol boat was clearly visible, its crew scanning the water with binoculars. Brooks studied the tactical situation. The patrol boat was positioned to observe all traffic leaving the harbor, but it couldn't inspect every vessel without creating a diplomatic incident with Turkey. Their best chance was to blend in with the normal flow of harbor traffic. "We go now," Stavros decided. Before they decide to become more curious about fishing boats. The engine coughed to life with the reliable sound of machinery that had been well maintained through decades of use. Stavros guided them away from the dock with the casual competence of a man navigating familiar waters, his boat indistinguishable from the dozens of other small craft moving through the harbor. As they passed the German patrol boat, Brooks felt the familiar tension of being observed by hostile forces. Through the fishing boat's windows, he could see German naval personnel watching the harbor traffic, their attention focused but not yet suspicious. Dr. Kellner sat quietly beside him, her research satchel clutched tightly in her lap. Everything that could change the course of the war was contained in that leather case, technical specifications that represented years of work by some of Germany's most brilliant minds, now being carried toward Allied hands by the very people who had created them. "Once we reach the European side," Brooks said quietly, "we'll be in neutral territory, but that doesn't mean we're safe. The Germans have a long reach, and they'll be very motivated to recover what you're carrying." Dr. Richter nodded grimly. "We understand. But there was no other choice. If Project Donnerschlag succeeds..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood what was at stake. The fishing boat cleared the harbor and began crossing the Bosphorus toward the European shore. Behind them, the minarets and domes of Istanbul's old city rose against the afternoon sky, while ahead lay the uncertain promise of Allied territory and safety. But Brooks had been in the intelligence business long enough to know that safety was always temporary, and their real challenges were just beginning. Chapter 5: The Double Cross. The Allied safe house on the European side of the Bosphorus occupied the upper floors of what appeared to be a modest import-export business specializing in Turkish carpets. Brooks had used the location twice before, and it had served its purpose admirably: excellent sight lines, multiple escape routes, and a cover story that explained the presence of foreigners conducting business at unusual hours. Dr. Kellner spread her research materials across a large table while Dr. Richter provided technical commentary that made Brooks' head spin. The scope of Project Donnerschlag was even more ambitious than he had initially understood. The Germans weren't just developing a new aircraft, they were creating an entirely new category of warfare. The propulsion system alone represents a breakthrough that will revolutionize aviation, Kellner explained, pointing to detailed engineering drawings. But combined with the guidance systems and payload capacity. She gestured helplessly, as if words were inadequate to describe the implications. Brooks studied the technical specifications with growing unease. According to these documents, the Storm Bird could deliver devastating attacks against targets across Western Europe, operating from bases deep within German territory and returning safely before Allied fighters could intercept them. How many prototypes exist? He asked. 3 completed, with production facilities prepared to manufacture 50 per month once full-scale production begins, Richter replied. We estimate that could happen within 6 months if there are no significant delays. 6 months. Brooks tried to imagine Allied invasion forces facing weapons like these and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air coming through the windows. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, the agreed-upon signal from James Whitmore. Brooks opened the door to find his contact, but something in the man's expression immediately triggered alarm bells. James. What's the situation? Good news and bad news, Whitmore replied, entering the room and nodding to the 2 scientists. The good news is that London is extremely interested in what our friends have brought us. Priority Alpha classification, immediate evaluation requested. And the bad news? SS Oberfuhrer Brenner has arrived on the European side. He's conducting a systematic search with Turkish cooperation, claiming the scientists stole classified military documents and requesting assistance in recovering stolen German property. Brooks felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with operational complications. Turkish neutrality was a delicate balance maintained through careful diplomacy, and if the Germans could present this as a simple matter of recovering stolen property. How much time do we have? Unknown. The Turks are trying to maintain neutrality, but Brenner is applying significant pressure. And there's something else, he's not working alone. Whitmore's expression darkened. Our surveillance teams report that he's been meeting with someone from the British community. Someone with detailed knowledge of our operations. The mole. Brooks had been expecting this moment since the operation began, but that didn't make it any less devastating. Someone within MI6's Istanbul network was actively working with the Germans, and they had access to enough classified information to compromise every Allied agent in the region. Do we have any idea who? 3 possibilities based on the surveillance reports. All of them have been present at meetings where sensitive information was discussed. Whitmore handed him a folder containing photographs and personnel files. Brooks recognized all 3 names, senior operatives with years of experience and previously spotless records. Any one of them could have provided the Germans with enough intelligence to roll up the entire network. Dr. Kellner looked up from her research materials. Gentlemen, while you're discussing security matters, I should mention that these documents represent only about 60% of Project Donnerschlag's technical specifications. Brooks felt his heart sink. What do you mean? The guidance systems, advanced metallurgy specifications, production procedures, those files were maintained separately for security reasons. Without them, much of what I've shown you would be incomplete. Where are the remaining files? Still in Germany, at the primary research facility near Munich. But. She paused, glancing at Dr. Richter. There may be copies here in Istanbul. Copies? Richter leaned forward. Anna created backup files for security purposes. Complete technical specifications, stored in a location that only she and I know about. Brooks felt a mixture of hope and dread. Complete specifications for the Storm Bird project would be invaluable to Allied planners, but if those files were still in Istanbul. Where? He asked simply. The German consulate, Kellner replied. Hidden in a location where even a thorough search wouldn't find them. The German consulate. The same heavily fortified building they had escaped from less than 24 hours ago, now certainly under maximum security alert and probably surrounded by additional German personnel looking for exactly the people now sitting in this room. That's impossible, Whitmore said flatly. After yesterday's incident, Brenner will have that building locked down tighter than a drum. Getting inside would require. He stopped mid-sentence as understanding dawned on his face. You're not seriously considering going back there? Brooks was already considering exactly that. The tactical situation was impossible, but impossible situations were often where the most important victories were won. Tell me about these backup files. How are they hidden? Dr. Kellner pulled out a small brass key from around her neck. There's a concealed compartment in the consulate's library, built into the original Ottoman architecture. The files are sealed in waterproof containers and hidden behind a false wall that appears to be solid stone. How do we access it? The key opens a mechanical lock that triggers the hidden mechanism. But you would need to know exactly where to look, and you would need approximately 10 minutes of uninterrupted access to retrieve everything. 10 minutes in the German consulate, under maximum security alert, with SS Oberfuhrer Brenner personally overseeing the search for the very people attempting the infiltration. Brooks had attempted suicide missions before, but this one was particularly creative in its impossibility. There might be another way, Whitmore said slowly. What if we didn't have to break in? Brooks looked at him questioningly. The mole. We know there's someone in our organization feeding intelligence to the Germans. What if we use that? Explain. We feed false information through channels we know are compromised. Make Brenner believe we're planning an extraction at a different location, draw off his security forces, create an opportunity. It was elegant in its simplicity, but it required identifying the mole with certainty and then manipulating them without arousing suspicion. One mistake would result in walking directly into a trap. We'd need to be absolutely certain about who the traitor is, Brooks said. I have an idea about that, Whitmore replied. But it involves considerable risk. Brooks gestured for him to continue. We feed different false information to each of our 3 suspects. Each story includes unique details that would allow us to identify which version reaches the Germans. When Brenner responds, we'll know exactly who betrayed us. Dr. Richter had been listening to the conversation with growing alarm. You're talking about using us as bait. Not bait, Brooks corrected. Misdirection. But yes, there's risk involved. Dr. Kellner closed her research files and looked directly at Brooks. How much risk? If we're successful, you'll be on a boat to Allied territory within 48 hours with complete intelligence that could help win the war. If we're unsuccessful, we'll be dead or in German custody, she finished matter-of-factly. Those are the only 2 options, aren't they? Brooks nodded grimly. I'm afraid so. Kellner exchanged a long look with Dr. Richter, and some communication passed between them that didn't require words. Finally, she nodded. We didn't come this far to stop now. What do you need us to do? Chapter 6, The Trap Within a Trap. The plan Brooks and Whitmore developed over the next several hours was complicated enough to satisfy a chess grandmaster and dangerous enough to give nightmares to anyone with basic survival instincts. It relied on precise timing, multiple layers of deception, and the assumption that their unknown mole would behave predictably when presented with irresistible intelligence. 3 different versions of their extraction plan were prepared, each containing unique operational details that would allow them to identify which version reached German hands. The first suggested a nighttime boat extraction from the Asian side of the city. The second described a land route through diplomatic channels using forged Turkish documents. The third involved hiding in plain sight by disguising the scientists as members of an archaeological expedition leaving the city through normal commercial channels. Each plan was presented to one of their 3 suspects through carefully constructed scenarios that appeared routine but provided opportunities for the information to be passed along. If their mole was motivated by money, ideology, or coercion, they would almost certainly relay details to their German handlers within hours. While they waited for results, Brooks focused on the secondary problem, how to actually retrieve the hidden files from the German consulate once they had identified and misdirected their traitor. The building's security has tripled since our escape, Whitmore reported. Additional guards, modified patrol schedules, and new communication protocols. Brenner is taking no chances. What about staff rotations? Kitchen workers, cleaning crews, maintenance personnel. All vetted and supervised more closely than before. But. Whitmore paused, consulting his notes. There's a weekly diplomatic reception tomorrow evening. Neutral diplomats, Turkish officials, some allied representatives maintaining formal relations. Brooks felt a spark of possibility. Who attends from our side? Usually the cultural attaché and his staff. Low-level diplomatic functions, mostly ceremonial. Could additional staff be added for a special event? Whitmore understood immediately where Brooks was heading. It's possible. The Germans would expect increased staff for a larger reception. Then we'll need invitations, proper credentials, and at least one person who can move through that building without attracting attention. Dr. Kellner looked up from where she had been studying building plans. I know the library layout better than anyone. If you can get me inside, I can retrieve the files. Absolutely not, Brooks said immediately. If you're recognized. I won't be. Brenner has never seen me in formal diplomatic attire, and the library will be off-limits to reception guests. I'll have the best chance of accessing the hidden compartment without detection. Dr. Richter shook his head. Anna, it's too dangerous. If something goes wrong. If something goes wrong, we're all dead anyway, she replied calmly. But if we succeed, the information in those files could save thousands of Allied lives. Brooks studied her carefully. Dr. Anna Kellner had already demonstrated remarkable courage and competence under pressure, but infiltrating a German diplomatic facility under maximum security was several orders of magnitude more dangerous than their previous escapes. You understand that if you're caught, we won't be able to help you. I understand. But Heinrich and I didn't defect to play it safe. We came to stop a weapon that could change the course of the war. The conviction in her voice decided the matter. Brooks had worked with professional agents who showed less determination in the face of mortal danger. Then we'll need to create the perfect cover identity, he said. And pray that our mole takes the bait exactly as we've planned. The answer came 18 hours later. German patrol boats began concentrating near the Asian waterfront, clearly preparing for a nighttime interdiction operation. The first version of their false intelligence, the boat extraction plan, had reached Brenner's hands. It's Morrison, Whitmore reported grimly. Senior case officer, 12 years of service, exemplary record until now. Charles Morrison. Brooks knew him by reputation, competent, reliable, trusted with some of MI6's most sensitive operations. The betrayal hit harder than he had expected. Do we know why? Not yet. Could be money, could be ideology, could be coercion. We'll sort that out later. Right now, we know that Brenner is deploying significant resources to intercept a boat extraction that isn't going to happen. While German forces concentrated on the waterfront, the consulate security would be marginally reduced, not enough to make infiltration easy, but perhaps enough to make it possible. The diplomatic reception was scheduled to begin at 7 p.m. By 6:30, Brooks was dressed in formal evening wear that had been hastily procured from contacts in the diplomatic community, carrying credentials identifying him as a temporary addition to the British Cultural Mission staff. Dr. Kellner had undergone a transformation that was genuinely startling. Her hair was styled in the current fashion, her evening dress was elegant but unremarkable, and she moved with the practiced poise of someone accustomed to diplomatic functions. Only her eyes remained the same, intelligent, determined, and slightly dangerous. Remember, Brooks said as they prepared to leave for the consulate, you're Margaret Thornton, assistant cultural attaché, recently arrived from Ankara. You've been asked to help catalog the consulate's library holdings for a cultural exchange program. And if someone becomes suspicious, you develop a sudden headache and need to step outside for fresh air. I'll be monitoring the reception from the main floor and can create a distraction if necessary. Dr. Richter would remain at the safe house with Whitmore, monitoring German radio traffic for any indication that their deception had been discovered. If Brooks and Kellner weren't back within 2 hours, he was to assume they had been captured and proceed immediately to a backup extraction point. The German consulate was brilliantly lit for the evening's reception, its Ottoman architecture providing an elegant backdrop for the carefully orchestrated diplomacy that kept Turkey balanced between the warring powers. Brooks and Kellner arrived separately, their forged invitations passing inspection without difficulty. Inside, the reception was proceeding exactly as diplomatic functions had for centuries: polite conversation, careful positioning, and the subtle gathering of information that was the real purpose of such events. Brooks positioned himself where he could observe the main corridors while maintaining appropriate diplomatic cover. Kellner moved through the reception with practiced ease, gradually working her way toward the library wing while engaging in the kind of superficial conversations that diplomatic events were designed to facilitate. Brooks watched her performance with professional admiration. She had clearly studied more than just aeronautical engineering during her years in academic circles. At precisely 8:15 p.m., she excused herself from a conversation about Turkish archaeological discoveries and slipped away from the main reception area. Brooks gave her a 5-minute head start, then began his own movement toward the library wing, ostensibly looking for a quiet place to review some cultural documents. The library was dark and empty, its shelves lined with books in German, Turkish, and several other languages. Kellner was already at work, her small flashlight illuminating the far wall where Ottoman stone masons had created decorative alcoves that appeared to be purely ornamental. She inserted her brass key into what looked like a crack in the stone, and Brooks heard the soft click of a mechanism that had been waiting decades for this moment. A section of the wall swung inward, revealing a hidden compartment that contained several waterproof cases. 15 minutes, she whispered as she began extracting the cases. Maybe less. Brooks positioned himself near the library entrance, listening for any indication that their presence had been detected. The reception continued in the distance, its sounds providing excellent cover for their activities. Kellner worked with swift efficiency, transferring files from the hidden compartment to a diplomatic pouch that would appear completely routine if observed by security personnel. The technical specifications she was retrieving represented years of German research and development, information that could give Allied scientists the knowledge they needed to develop countermeasures. They were almost finished when Brooks heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Heavy boots, moving with military precision rather than diplomatic courtesy. Someone was conducting a security sweep, and they were heading directly for the library. "Anna," he whispered urgently. "Time's up." She grabbed the remaining files and triggered the mechanism to close the hidden compartment. The stone wall swung back into position just as the library door opened and light from the corridor illuminated the room. SS Oberfuhrer Klaus Brenner stood in the doorway, his pale eyes taking in every detail of the scene before him. Behind him were 2 armed guards, their hands resting casually on their weapons. "Good evening," Brenner said in accented English. "I don't believe we've been introduced." Chapter 7, Face to Face with Death. Brooks felt the familiar calm that came with mortal danger. All the planning and preparation were finished, survival now depended on quick thinking and perfect performance under pressure. "David Harrison, British Cultural Attaché," he said, extending his hand with the confidence of someone who belonged exactly where he was. "And this is my colleague, Margaret Thornton. We were just admiring your library collection." Brenner's handshake was firm and brief, his eyes never leaving Brooks' face. "Klaus Brenner, SS Oberfuhrer. I'm responsible for consulate security during my visit. May I ask what brought you to the library during a social reception?" Dr. Kellner stepped forward smoothly. "I'm cataloging library holdings for a proposed cultural exchange program between our governments. Even during wartime, scholarship must continue, don't you think?" Her performance was flawless, the slight nervousness appropriate for a junior diplomat meeting a senior German officer, combined with the earnest enthusiasm of an academic discussing her specialty. Brooks felt a surge of admiration for her composure. Brenner studied them both with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating potential prey. Cultural exchange. How admirable. And what have you discovered about our collection? Remarkable holdings in Ottoman history, Kellner replied. The architectural texts alone represent centuries of Islamic scholarship. Your consul has assembled quite an impressive library. Indeed he has. Brenner moved further into the room, his guards remaining in the doorway. Tell me, Miss Thornton, do you read German? Adequately for academic purposes. Then perhaps you noticed some of our more recent acquisitions. Technical journals, scientific publications, that sort of thing. Brooks felt tension coil in his stomach. Brenner was probing, looking for reactions that would confirm his suspicions. The man's reputation for psychological manipulation was well deserved. I'm afraid my interests run more toward historical texts, Kellner replied. Technical subjects are rather beyond my expertise. How modest of you. Brenner picked up a book from a nearby table, examining its cover with apparent interest. You know, we've had some security concerns recently. Technical documents that seem to have wandered away from their proper locations. How unfortunate, Brooks said. Industrial espionage is such an ungentlemanly business. Brenner's smile was like winter sunlight, present but without warmth. Indeed. Though I suspect the perpetrators considered themselves patriots rather than criminals. The psychological chess match continued for several more minutes, with Brenner probing for weaknesses while Brooks and Kellner maintained their diplomatic cover. But Brooks could see the calculation in the German officer's eyes. He was suspicious but not yet certain. Well, Brooks said finally, we should return to the reception. The ambassador will be wondering where we've disappeared to. Of course. But first. Brenner gestured to his guards, who stepped aside to allow a fourth person to enter the library. Charles Morrison walked into the room with the defeated expression of a man who had run out of options. His face was pale, and Brooks could see the tremor in his hands that suggested he was operating under extreme stress. Mr. Morrison here has been telling me the most interesting stories about British intelligence operations in Istanbul, Brenner said conversationally. Perhaps you'd like to hear some of them? The trap had been sprung, but not in the way Brooks had expected. Morrison hadn't just been identified as the mole, he had been captured and was now being used as a weapon against them. I'm afraid Mr. Morrison has been under considerable strain lately, Brooks said carefully. The pressures of diplomatic work can be quite overwhelming. Oh, I think his mind is quite clear, Brenner replied. Clear enough to identify Dr. Heinrich Richter and Dr. Anna Kellner, despite their remarkable transformations. The game was over. Brooks felt the weight of the diplomatic pouch containing the stolen technical specifications, knowing that its contents represented the difference between Allied victory and catastrophic defeat. I'm not sure what you're implying, he said, but even as he spoke, he was calculating distances, cover positions, and the likelihood of fighting their way out of the consulate. I'm implying nothing. I'm stating facts. Brenner's voice hardened. Dr. Anna Kellner, you are under arrest for theft of classified German military documents and treason against the Reich. Kellner stepped forward, her diplomatic mask finally slipping to reveal the brilliant scientist beneath. Klaus Brenner. I know your reputation. You're the man who sent Dr. Weber's family to Dachau because he questioned the ethics of chemical weapons research. Dr. Weber lacked proper appreciation for the necessities of warfare. I trust you won't make the same mistake. The only mistake I made was not defecting sooner. Brenner gestured to his guards, who began moving toward them. In seconds, they would be in German custody, and the technical specifications for Project Donnerschlag would be lost. Brooks made his decision. The library's lights went out suddenly, plunging the room into darkness. In the confusion that followed, Brooks grabbed Kellner's hand and pulled her toward the rear of the room, where he had noticed a second exit during their brief reconnaissance. Shots rang out behind them, muzzle flashes illuminating the chaos as German guards tried to target invisible enemies. Brooks heard Brenner shouting orders in rapid German, his voice carrying the fury of a predator whose prey had escaped at the last moment. They reached the rear exit, a service door that led to the consulate's kitchen area. Beyond that lay the staff quarters and, hopefully, a route to the outside world that didn't involve fighting through an army of German security personnel. The kitchen was empty, its staff presumably attending to the reception. Brooks led Kellner through the maze of preparation areas toward what he hoped was an exit, guided by memory and desperation in equal measure. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were growing closer. Brenner had organized his search with military efficiency, and they were being systematically cut off from potential escape routes. They reached a delivery entrance that opened onto an alley behind the consulate. The evening air felt like freedom, but Brooks knew their escape was far from complete. The building would be surrounded within minutes, and German agents throughout the city would be mobilized to recapture them. This way, he said, leading Kellner away from the lights of the main streets toward the narrow passages of the old city where shadows could still provide sanctuary for those who knew how to use them. As they disappeared into the maze of Constantinople's ancient streets, the diplomatic reception continued in the German consulate, its guests unaware that the course of the war might have just shifted in a darkened library where Ottoman architects had hidden secrets that would outlast empires. Chapter 8, The Final Gambit. The abandoned silk warehouse in the Fadi district had been chosen as their final rendezvous point precisely because it offered no obvious advantages. No multiple exits, no sophisticated hiding places, no strategic positioning that would help them if discovered. Sometimes, Brooks had learned, the safest place to hide was somewhere your enemies wouldn't expect you to choose. Dr. Richter was waiting for them with news that was both encouraging and terrifying. London has confirmed receipt of the first batch of technical specifications, he reported. They're calling it the most significant intelligence breakthrough of the war. But, Brooks prompted. German radio traffic suggests they know exactly what we took. Brenner is coordinating with Berlin to change all security protocols, modify technical specifications, and accelerate the timeline for Project Donnerschlag. Dr. Kellner opened the diplomatic pouch and spread the retrieved files across a makeshift table. Then these become even more crucial. The backup files contain information that can't be changed quickly, metallurgy specifications, production techniques, design tolerances that took years to develop. Brooks studied the documents with growing understanding. The first batch of intelligence had been devastating but incomplete. These files filled in the gaps that could make the difference between Allied scientists understanding the threat and actually developing countermeasures. How long do we have before the information becomes obsolete? Days, not weeks, Dr. Richter replied. Once they realize the full extent of what we've taken, they'll begin modification procedures that could neutralize much of our intelligence advantage. The tactical situation was brutally simple. They had intelligence that could help win the war, but only if they could get it to London before the Germans could adapt. Every hour of delay increased the likelihood that their sacrifice would be meaningless. What are our extraction options? Brooks asked Whitmore, who had been monitoring German activities throughout the city. Limited and getting worse. Brenner has mobilized every German agent in Istanbul, plus he's convinced the Turkish authorities to increase their cooperation in the name of recovering stolen diplomatic property. The harbor is under surveillance, the major roads are being monitored, and the railroad stations are crawling with German security personnel. What about diplomatic channels? Compromised. Morrison provided them with detailed information about our communication networks and safe houses. We have to assume that everything he knew is now in German hands. Brooks felt the familiar weight of an impossible situation. They had accomplished their primary mission, securing intelligence that could change the course of the war, but they were trapped in a city that was rapidly becoming a German-controlled fortress. There might be another way, Dr. Kellner said quietly. But it would require considerable risk. More risk than we're already facing. Different risk. Instead of trying to escape with the intelligence, we transmit it. Brooks looked at her questioningly. The German consulate has powerful radio equipment for communicating with Berlin. If we could access it. You want to break back into the consulate? I want to use their own equipment to send our intelligence directly to London. Complete technical specifications, transmitted in a single burst that would be completed before they could stop us. The audacity of the plan was breathtaking. Breaking into the German consulate once had been nearly impossible. Breaking in again, after their security had been tripled and their personnel were specifically looking for the same infiltrators, was beyond impossible. It would be a suicide mission, Whitmore said flatly. Maybe, Kellner replied. But if we succeed, the intelligence reaches London regardless of what happens to us. If we fail trying to escape through conventional channels, the intelligence dies with us. Dr. Richter leaned forward. Anna, there has to be another way. Heinrich, we've spent months watching our colleagues develop weapons that could murder millions of innocent people. We defected because we couldn't live with that knowledge. Now we have a chance to do something meaningful about it. Brooks found himself considering the tactical requirements. The consulate's radio room would be heavily guarded, but it was also a functional facility that operated around the clock. There would be brief windows when the equipment was unattended, and a skilled operator could transmit substantial amounts of data in a very short time. How long would you need to transmit everything? 10 minutes for the complete files, assuming the equipment is properly calibrated. 5 minutes for the most critical specifications if we have to abbreviate. And you can operate German military radio equipment? Kellner's smile was grim. I helped design some of the encoding protocols. I know exactly how their system works. The plan that emerged over the next 2 hours was elegantly simple and completely insane. They would create a diversion that would draw security forces away from the consulate, infiltrate the building during the confusion, transmit the intelligence to London, and then, well, the plan became somewhat vague after that point. The reception is ending soon, Whitmore observed. Diplomatic guests will be departing, which means increased activity around the building but also more confusion as the staff transitions from hosting duties to normal operations. How do we create a diversion significant enough to pull guards away from the radio room? Leave that to me, Brooks said. I've been saving a few surprises for special occasions. The explosives had been hidden in various locations around Istanbul as part of standard operating procedure for MI6 agents operating in hostile territory. Brooks had never expected to use them all in a single operation, but desperate times called for creative solutions. At 11:30 p.m., a series of small explosions erupted throughout the Para district. Nothing dramatic enough to cause civilian casualties, but sufficient to suggest a coordinated attack on German facilities. Within minutes, sirens were wailing and German security forces were responding to multiple locations that seemed to be under simultaneous assault. The consulate's guard force was reduced by half as personnel were deployed to investigate the apparent terrorist attacks. Those who remained were focused on external threats rather than internal security, creating exactly the window of opportunity that Brooks had hoped for. Dr. Kellner approached the building from the rear, dressed in the uniform of a Turkish telephone technician, the same cover that had worked for Brooks 2 days earlier. Her forged work order indicated emergency repairs to communication lines damaged by the recent explosions. The remaining guards, distracted by the chaos throughout the district, barely glanced at her credentials as she entered through the service entrance. Within minutes, she had located the radio room and begun the process of accessing the German military communication network. Brooks positioned himself in the alley behind the consulate, monitoring German radio traffic and preparing to create additional diversions if necessary. The intelligence he was listening to suggested that Brenner was coordinating the response to the explosions personally, which meant he was away from the consulate and unlikely to return quickly. Inside the building, Dr. Kellner worked with the focused intensity of someone who understood that the next few minutes would determine whether her defection had been worthwhile. The German radio equipment was sophisticated and powerful, capable of transmitting large amounts of data across vast distances with remarkable clarity. She began with the most critical files, the technical specifications that would be hardest for the Germans to modify quickly. Production procedures, metallurgy data, design tolerances that represented years of research and development. Information that Allied scientists could use to develop countermeasures regardless of whatever modifications the Germans might make to their original plans. The transmission progress indicator showed steady advancement through the files. 5 minutes elapsed, then 8, then 10. The complete technical specifications for Project Donnerschlag were racing through the airwaves toward London, where they would be analyzed by the best scientific minds the Allied forces could assemble. At 11 minutes, the radio room door burst open. SS Oberfuhrer Klaus Brenner stood in the doorway, his uniform disheveled from responding to the explosions but his eyes sharp with triumph. Behind him were armed guards whose weapons were already trained on Dr. Kellner. "Dr. Anna Kellner," he said formally. "You are under arrest for espionage, treason, and theft of classified military documents." Kellner looked up from the radio equipment, her hand still resting on the transmission controls. "Klaus Brenner. You're too late." "Am I?" He gestured to the radio equipment. "German military communications are monitored by our own intelligence services. Every transmission is recorded, every frequency is tracked. We know exactly what you've sent and where you've sent it. Then you know that your Project Donnerschlag is finished." Brenner's smile was cold and satisfied. "On the contrary, Dr. Kellner. You've just provided us with invaluable intelligence about British communication networks, transmission protocols, and intelligence priorities. The information you've stolen will indeed reach London, but it will reach Berlin first." The trap within the trap. Brooks felt the weight of absolute defeat as he realized the scope of German counterintelligence operations. They had been allowed to steal the technical specifications, allowed to escape, allowed to attempt transmission, all so that German intelligence could map British networks and feed false information directly into Allied planning systems. But Dr. Kellner was smiling. "You're absolutely right, Oberfuhrer. You have been monitoring German military communications. But I wasn't using German military communications." She gestured to the radio equipment, which Brooks could now see had been modified with additional components that hadn't been part of the original German installation. "Turkish diplomatic frequencies," she explained calmly. "Routed through neutral relay stations to British diplomatic facilities in Cairo. Your monitoring systems were recording everything I transmitted, but unfortunately for you, I was transmitting on channels your systems don't monitor." Brenner's expression shifted from triumph to fury as he realized he had been outmaneuvered by a woman he had underestimated. "Kill her," he ordered his guards. The gunshots that followed echoed through the German consulate and across the Bosphorus, where the ancient city of Constantinople had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the clash of civilizations, and now the desperate gambit of individuals who had risked everything to change the course of history.